Hello and welcome to the official reading of the second short story here on ThreeDayStories.com. If you don't know what this blog and this channel is about yet, then just click right about here and you will get a short introduction. If you want to check out the subjects that I drew for this 3-day cycle story, then you can click right about here. And if you want to read along as I read the story, then you can click right about. No. So the topic that I chose was the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, and this story is called, I have to read it, Ceratotherium simum. Jim could have spit on the guy's head. He was that short. In the museum he would have had no problem just picking him up by the back of his shirt and dragging him out. Only if there was just reason to do so, of course. But now the little man seemed intimidating, not physically but psychologically. Although his head and his eyes were motionless and firmly pointed towards him, his hands were twitchy. He kept feeling his fingertips as though he had just burned them on a hot mug of coffee. Maybe he was just itching to pull out a knife and ram it between Jim's ribs. "Just another minute," said the little man, and raised the corners of his mouth in a polite attempt to smile. Jim nodded and swallowed, although there was no spit left in his mouth to swallow. A week earlier, Jim stood in front of his new locker, number 121. He wondered why there were so many of them. How many people does it take to run a museum? He tightened the tie around his neck and folded down his collar. Then he stepped outside the dressing room and started his first day. Emilia led him all around the museum he was supposed to guard from now on. Jim could see how passionate she was about her work, something that he had never really experienced. But this woman was flailing her arms, speaking loudly, and trying not to smile too much while explaining the ins and outs of her little world. Jim felt like he should be listening, but it was much more satisfying to just watch her. He lost himself in the swinging of her dark brown curls as he followed her through the different areas of the museum. When she stopped to turn around, he would quickly divert his gaze and start nodding, as if he had any idea what she had just said. At the end of the tour, she asked him if he had any questions. For a split second he thought about asking her out, but quickly banished that thought and shook his head. He was smart enough to know that it wouldn't be a good idea to ask out your boss on your first day. And he was smart enough to know that he would be too dumb for a woman like her, or at least not worldly enough. A week had passed without excitement. He came into work at 8 at night and left at 6 in the morning. He spent his time looking at monitors, walking his routes and reading singles ads online. He had seen Emilia only once. She was on her way out and talking to a colleague. He tried to say hi, but she seemed to have mistaken him for a visitor, since he hadn't put on his uniform yet. He was disappointed that he didn't have anything more to say to her. It was 4:45 on a Saturday morning, and his eyelids started to get heavy. He decided it was time for another round through the museum to stay awake. His hand had already reached out for the empty pot of coffee, as it had become reflex. The coffee that had been in there the nights and years before left streaks and stains around its rim. He had noticed that many of the curators of the museum had the habit of rather having tea, which Jim felt lent them a certain sophistication. He decided to put the pot back down and put a kettle on the stove in the little employee kitchen instead. On his walk through the museum, Jim heard a noise coming from one of the storage rooms. He had never actually been in there because it was always locked and only had one door in and out. He fumbled around with this big ring of keys before he finally found the right one. The inside of the storage was even darker than the rest of the museum, since it didn't have any windows for moonlight to shine through. There was that sound again, a little rattling from the other end of the room. "Anyone there?" Jim shouted, but got no answer. He slowly began to wake up a bit. The room was full of large cabinets with tiny labels on its white drawers. Jim slowly walked towards the source of the sound as it kept on rattling and scraping. Suddenly his eyes landed on an open shelf. It was full of human skulls. Slowly it came back to Jim that Emilia had said something about a human bone collection. He didn't really remember anything else, but he remembered that she seemed very proud. When Jim reached the last corner of the room, the scraping stopped. He shined some light into the corners, trying to see if anyone or anything was hiding there. But it was all just a lot of dust and old furniture. As he turned around to leave, he suddenly saw something moving and jerked to the side. He tripped and heard a loud crack. While he was trying to pull himself back together, he saw a mouse running along one of the shelves and disappear behind a stack of books. "Little dumbass," he mumbled, not sure if he meant the mouse or himself. He reached for the flashlight that had fallen to the floor and tried to see what he had broken. Right before his eyes lay a skull and several fragments of bone, which had splintered off when the skull had hit the ground. He knew what all the pieces in the museum were worth. He could have never paid for it and had kind of grown accustomed to this job, especially since he was still hoping to somehow get the attention of Emilia. He stood there for a minute just staring at the white bits in front of him. The faint whistle of the kettle shook him out of his apathy. He shook his head and exhaled, then quickly scooped up the pieces of bone and put them in the pocket of his jacket. The skull he put back into the shelf and threw a small tablecloth over it that had been lying on the little desk a few steps away. His heart raced as he fumbled for the key again. He had never actually touched a dead person, let alone stolen one, or parts of it. His tea tasted bitter, but that probably wasn't the tea's fault, since he let it steep for a good 15 minutes. He had forgotten about it while palpating the little sharp objects in his pocket. When he left the museum that morning, he was surprised to see Emilia coming towards him in the entrance area of the museum. He had heard that some of the researchers even came in on the weekend, but for some reason he hadn't expected to see her on a Saturday. He immediately stopped breathing. He feared that she could see in his face that he had done something bad. But she had her head buried in a book and didn't even seem to see him. He mumbled a short "morning" while passing her. Every muscle in his body tensed as he was expecting her to ask him something about his suspicious behavior, but she didn't even acknowledge him. Not even a nod. Jim's eyebrows lowered into a frown as he left the building. The waitress had just put down Jim's plate of bacon and pancakes when Andy pulled into the parking lot of the little diner. The waitress rolled her eyes and gave Jim an annoyed look because Andy's car sounded more like an old propeller plane with its rumbling and banging. When Andy came in, he shot a sly smile towards the middle-aged waitress and strutted towards Jim. The waitress just muttered, yeah, and wrote down Andy's usual order. "Jimmy, buddy, haven't seen you on the range in a while." "Yeah, I started this new job about a week ago and didn't really have much time for our usual shenanigans." "No problem. What's the job?" "I'm the new night shift security guard at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History." "Whoa, that's cool. Night at the museum, huh?" "Yeah, it's nothing like that, though. I mostly just sit and surf the web." "So you get paid to do what others do in their free time? Jackpot!" Andy laughed. Jim just nodded while staring at his plate. "So why the early phone call on Saturday? Can't a friend just invite a friend to breakfast?" "Jimmy, buddy, we've been friends for 7 years now, and never ever before have you invited me to breakfast." Jim looked up to see the waitress arrive with Andy's food. He remained silent until she had left again. He leaned forward. "I've done something dumb and need some advice." Andy leaned in as well and calmly said, "Lay it on me." "Well, He stopped. Then he forced it out. "I need to get rid of human body parts." Andy dropped his fork and had to restrain himself not to yell. "Jesus Christ, Jimmy! The fuck have you done?" Jim felt a lot of eyes on him and motioned his hands for Andy to lower his voice. No, not like that." "Then what, Jim? Spit it out." Jim reached into his pocket and slowly placed the pieces of bone on the table. Andy frowned. "What's that?" Jim began to tell the story while Andy was eating his breakfast. When he was done, he just stared at Andy, hoping for some kind of suggestion on how to handle the situation. "Well, you could just throw it in the trash and forget about it," Andy suggested nonchalantly. "I don't know. Feels kind of disrespectful to the poor guy. I thought maybe I'd find a way of returning it anonymously or something." Andy wiped off his face and took a good look at the bone fragments, then picked them up and gently weighed them in his hands. "I got a guy that will probably give you about $2,000 for this." "What?" Jimmy exploded. "Yeah. No, that's terrible. I mean, who knows what he's going to do with it?" "Who cares?" "I do." "Well, you asked for my suggestions, you got them." "Yeah, thanks." Jim muttered while rubbing the bones between his fingers. Andy got up and took his jacket. Well, call me up if you want to go up to the range together, and thanks for the breakfast. Andy knocked on the table and left. Jim had been sitting in his car for half an hour. On his lap, a little plastic bag with the bones. He watched as the last visitors left the museum and the parking lot slowly emptied. Emilia's car was still standing there. He had made up his mind. He would return the bones, explain the unfortunate circumstances, and apologize. Maybe his honesty could save his job, he thought. And maybe he would even impress Emilia. But that was maybe a bit far-fetched. After another half hour, Emilia emerged from the employee entrance and made her way towards her car. She was taking quick steps, and Jim had to hurry to catch up to her. She was just about to open her car when he started talking. Excuse me, I just want to talk to you for a minute. Emilia didn't react, but Jim continued. I just want to tell you. Emilia suddenly shot around. Oh, you startled me. Have a nice weekend too. She didn't stop what she was doing, though. Jim didn't know what was happening to him. She got in her car and closed the door. Then she gave him a little wave and nod and drove away. Jim just stood there silently, staring to where the car had disappeared behind the trees. Was he that appalling? Was his presence so unbearable? Wasn't he even worth a minute of conversation? As Jim sat back down in the driver's seat of his car, he had a decision to make. Either he was actually a worthless piece of shit, like her behavior implied, or she was a stuck-up bitch who didn't deserve to have her precious bones back anyway. Are you sure you want to do this? Jim looked at the little bag with the white powder in his hand. Andy had instructed him to grind them up, and Jim had busted his old coffee grinder trying to get the powder fine enough. Yeah, let's do this. Just let me do the talking. They got out of Andy's car and walked into the little 24/7 corner store. A Korean man behind the counter was flipping through a tabloid and tried hard to ignore them. We'd like to talk to the store owner, Andy demanded. The man behind the counter slowly raised his head, and then an eyebrow. Jim, show him. Andy nudged him. Jim pulled out the little plastic bag from his pocket. The Korean man glanced around and tried to see if someone was going to enter the store. Then he motioned for them to follow him. They walked through a long corridor. The walls were lined with dirty cages of animals that had once suffered to live in them. They reached a little room with a little bar, where they were instructed to wait. The other end of the room had a brightly lit aquarium that filled almost the entire wall's width. Jim was shuffling his feet around and became quite uncomfortable. All of a sudden a door opened and 3 Asian men in black suits entered the room. They weren't tall or muscular, but they walked very straight and their motions were very controlled, which gave them the aura of fighting dogs ready to attack. Gentlemen, we got some very fine horn here, superb quality, Andy blurted out. Jim's head shot around quickly, eyes wide open. Andy's look suggested he better keep his mouth shut. One of the Asian men took the bag from Jim's hand and brought it close to his face. He moved the powder between his fingers and seemed to feel for impurities or other signs of counterfeit. Then he asked, Simum or bicornis? Andy answered, Simum. Jim had to control his reactions. He used his eyes to ask Andy what they were talking about. Andy whispered to him, It's a species of rhinoceros. 2 of the men turned around to leave the room with the bag. Andy made a step forward to follow them, but was stopped with a firm palm on the chest by the 3rd man. They exchanged a tense smile, and Andy made a step back. They waited for what felt like an eternity. Jim thought about how the man in front of him wasn't that threatening by himself. He was short and in a suit. It was the setting and the reason they were here that gave the man in the suit his power. Finally, the door opened again, and the 2 men came back out. You, leave, they commanded Andy. I'm going nowhere without Jim. He pumped himself up. The man that had watched them took a step towards him and revealed a knife in a holster beneath his jacket. Okay. He raised his hands up to his hips and made a few steps backwards. Jim, don't let them pull a fast one on you. Then he was escorted outside. Jim turned to the 2 Asian gentlemen. Look, I don't want to get in trouble. If you don't want the stuff, I'm out of your hair. Just like this. He motioned for the plastic bag. Not so fast, Mr. Jim. We know that this isn't what your little friend claimed. Jim's whole body tightened. Oh God, I'm so sorry. I had no idea he would say that. I'm so sorry, please don't hurt me. Well, we don't like being lied to. Jim shook his head to signal that he understood. That is why we'll make this easy for you, Mr. Jim. We think we know what this is. We wouldn't want another lie. And since we want to make business with you, we won't put you on the spot to tell us where you got it from. We wouldn't want another lie now, would we? Jim's neck was too clenched to properly shake his head, but he got the message across. So there are about 15 grams in this bag. We want about 3 times this much every week. What? No! Jim exclaimed. This was meant to be a one-time thing. Well, in business you have to make compromises, Mr. Jim. This is your compromise. The alternative doesn't seem as beneficial for you. Jim's mouth tightened. We are sure that there is more where this came from. You will not fail us, Mr. Jim, won't you? Jim chewed his lip. He thought about Emilia and the pride she seemed to express for her collection. On the other hand, what are 45 grams a week? Surely no one would notice if 1 or 2 of the thousands of bones were missing. And it would be a nice welcome way to pay back the indifference that was sent his way. No, I won't fail you. The next day, Jim was manning the little security booth at the main entrance of the museum. His right hand was in the pocket of his jacket. Over and over again, his thumb leafed through the small bundle of cash he had gotten in exchange for his bones the night before. He didn't necessarily need the money, but it was strangely satisfying anyway. Suddenly he saw Emilia pass by, on her way out. Have a nice evening, Jim said in his most sarcastic voice, but she didn't even look at him. What a bitch, Jim murmured towards his colleague, who was about to leave. She probably didn't hear you. Jim shook his head. His colleague hesitated. You know she's hard of hearing, right? She must have mentioned it when she showed you around the museum. And after a little pause he added, Did you even listen to what she said? Jim didn't answer. He leaned out of his booth to see if he could still spot her, but she was gone. Did you hear what I said? Asked the colleague. Jim fell back into his chair and stared into the void. He started chewing his lip again. His colleague was ready to leave. Okay, whatever. Have a good shift. He left Jim behind in his booth. Suddenly the wad of bills in Jim's pocket felt much heavier. He tasted a drop of blood from his lip, but that didn't stop him from chewing further. Jim got up and robotically turned on the coffee machine. It was going to be a long night. So yes, that was the second story here on ThreeDayStories.com. Please let me know what you think. Leave a comment under the video or on the blog. Send me a tweet or join me on Facebook. And if you liked it, I would be happy if you shared this video or this story, depending on where you view this video. And if you came back.